All right, everyone, good afternoon. As we get started with today's event, here are a few rules for engagement. To reduce background noise, we ask that participants please put your microphones on mute when you're not speaking. We don't mind if you keep your video on. In fact, we'd love to see your faces. Additionally, in the unlikely event that this Zoom meeting is compromised by outside entities, the host of the meeting will close the session and send all participants a new link to resume. We're not going to have a real question and answer portion in this event tonight. We're going to be using breakout rooms. But if there's an opportunity for people to ask questions, the moderator, Dr. Muhammad, will call on folks if they use the raise your hand function, or you can use the chat function of the event or in the Zoom meeting. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sakubin, who's going to get us started.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bruce, and thank you for helping us organize from the back end. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Gigi Sakubin, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at Ohio University. It's my privilege to welcome all of you to the Researchers Roundtable, which is day 2 of our 2-part lecture series, The Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, hosted by the Division of Diversity and Inclusion. Today's event is part of our monthly D&I speaker series that elevates diverse voices and discusses current and historical issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking critically at our histories and in re-examining previously held notions based on current research has been a particular focus of this series. Once again, we are so excited to welcome back Dr. Stephen Micheletti and Dr. Joanna Mountain from 23andMe to speak to us about their groundbreaking study. As a quick recap for those who did not attend last week, the study provides evidence of the sexual violence that permeated every aspect of the slave trade and traces the forced cross-continental movement displacement of African peoples. This investigation establishes genetic links between individuals in the Americas and populations across the Atlantic and Africa. In that way, this work enriches and complicates our understanding of this most violent period in our history that ranged roughly from 1515 to 1865. As I was listening to the presentation last week, I was actually struck by its incredible timeliness for our own times, where we ask urgent questions about racial justice and how we can move forward from violent histories to move to more just and equitable tomorrows. Today's event will continue the conversation from last week with a particular focus on methods and implications for past and future research. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Robin Muhammad, Associate Professor of African American Studies and Chair of Faculty Senate, who will again moderate and facilitate today's discussion. I also want to welcome back again from California, and actually Dr. Muhammad is in California as well, Dr. Micheletti and Dr. Mountain, and I'll hand things over to you now, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, everybody.
Dr. Muhammad,
there. I am.
Yes.
I've now become a meme that does not unmute. Sorry about that. Again, welcome everyone. If you were with us last week, you know we covered as much ground as we could dealing with the research that has been done by Dr. Joanna Mountain and Dr. Stephen Micheletti. This week, what we were hoping, after having sent out some reading material, that we could do a little bit of a deeper dive into the research, into the questions that were raised last week, and to really to entertain maybe some other questions that haven't been raised yet. We do have a limited amount of time. We're going to be in breakout sessions, 3 of them corresponding to the 3 questions that you see on your screen. As you've entered the room, you've been assigned by Dwayne Bruce to one of these 3 areas. We're hoping that the questions are open enough for you to participate and to reflect on the reading if you were able to do it, but also not restricting you if you weren't able to get to the reading just to talk about the articles or the specifics of the research. We really want this to be an open-ended conversation within the context of 20 minutes. And that's the other parameter that's really important here. In these breakout sessions, we're going to have about 30 minutes to dive into these individual questions, perhaps raise some other questions and begin to answer them. Each of the sessions will be moderated by myself or Dr. Joanna Mountain or Dr. Stephen Micheletti. And hopefully there will be a generous volunteer who will take notes while the discussion is taking place, so that when we come back after 30 minutes, we can, each of the three groups can share out one or two items that came up in the process of that discussion. Since we are a relatively large group, remember that we do have a time limit, and be mindful of holding space for people so that they can say, raise questions, say what they need to say, and explore that. But be mindful that the time is limited, and hopefully everyone will get a chance to participate in a meaningful way. And with that, do we want to go through these questions? I think they're fairly straightforward. But if Dwayne, if we have everyone assigned at this point, we can just go right into those rooms.
We can go right into the rooms they're assigned, and I'll hit the button now.
Wayne, Wayne, 1 second.
Okay.
Are the rooms going to correspond to breakout room 1? It goes is only question 1. Is that how we're doing it, or all breakout rooms do all questions?
One question per room.
And breakout room number 1 is going to do question 1, and breakout room number 2 will do question 2, and so on. Okay.
And if you have time and you want to explore the other questions, that'll work too, right?
Absolutely. Okay. You're not restricted.
Right.
These are the major prompts. Okay. All right. See
Thank
you all in 30 minutes. Everybody here?
Everybody's here.
Great. Welcome back all. I hope the breakout session went well, and I'd like to just move through each of them with just one or two reports on questions that remain, or points that wanted to raise. Our group was group 1, which was dealing with the question pivoting around the challenges and considerations for researchers who are delving into the present and the past of individuals and communities they are researching. And just one or two pieces, and then I want to leave the larger question for the wrap-up questions. One of the things that was brought up was the nature of the survey questions generally, like what was being asked specifically within, say, the 23andMe surveys. And that question and some related ones were raised because the group was raising not just concerns, but concerns and curiosity around, should I participate in a genetic, not just genetic research, but sort of a genetic test at all? And then secondly, do I want to participate in this research, and what are the implications in terms of privacy, or whether or not the data is sold, and et cetera. So it sort of mirrored some of the questions that had come up last week. I also think that another issue that was raised was these tests, particularly for people but not only for people of color, but because this is part of our focus, as many of us are descendants of slaves and enslaved people. What does this mean for the community? All right, so if I am individually curious and want to know, I'm not just finding out for myself, I'm finding out information that really has implications for my family and for my community. So I thought those were really two nicely nuanced points, and there were others, but I'll save those and ask perhaps group 2 to speak. Not the whole group, just designated individual. Who was in group 2?
So I was the moderator, and we had Mary volunteered to be asked. Right, thank you, Mary.
I didn't know what group number we were. So I would say we had a very interesting conversation. We had a mix of current and retired faculty, administrators, alumni, and a few students. Most all of us were really just wanting to listen and learn more from Joanna. And so she shared more about her experience venturing into this research and the encouragement she received both with her time at Stanford, as well as during her 20 or 15 or 13 years, excuse me, at 23andMe. So we were discussing two types of genetic research, both among the living as well as deceased people's remains. So our discussion related to bias included discussing how it's possible to have bias, whether the DNA was collected during the past and the present. There may have been distinct biases based on who was taking those records or samples, during colonial times when racism was more embedded in, how field research existed or was practiced in those days. And for current collection, it was mentioned again that the way 23andMe is doing their research is primarily through the folks that are accessing their service. And so it's voluntary and with very informed consent. We talked about as well biases, including differences among the researchers, differences in education, that they're primarily from Northern European descent. Although there's been at 23andMe a very concerted effort to expand the diversity of researchers, I think, to balance that out. And then we talked about it as it relates to algorithms, how kind of the world, as the data was coming in, was originally kind of sectioned out into smaller areas. And then it sounded like, Joanna, please correct me if I'm misremembering our conversation, that as the body of data grew, the detail related to geography was able to be more nuanced and targeted. And we also, just at the end of our conversation, we're talking about just the issue of collecting genetic samples is still very controversial in a lot of ways. And we discussed the ongoing development of some best practice guidelines related to that, that 23andMe is working on, and that, IRB processes vary from country to country, and some are less rigorous than if the research was being done in the United States, as an example. So
Okay.
those were the notes that I took.
Great. And some of that overlapped really nicely with some of the conversation that was going in group 1. Group 3.
Sure, I took a couple notes. We had very interesting discussion and touched upon a couple different topics. First, we talked about the power of multidisciplinary studies and how it's important for multiple disciplines to come together to really enhance a research project. We also brought up the point of how do you trust certain historical records when you know that there are gaps in those records and they may not be 100% accurate, because over time, a lot of records have relied upon recovering the original, say, manifests or bulletins or newspaper articles. We also got into talking about how slavery is taught in primarily U.S. education, or more so the lack thereof. So there's kind of this, there's this lack of knowledge about certain aspects of the slave trade because it's simply not taught, especially in primary schools. And while our study is great in that it enlightens so many people and brings these facts to them, on the other hand, a lot of these should have been already well known through the education system. So we talked about that and how it differs in Germany, say, where the Holocaust is front and center, and the country really made an effort to teach the Holocaust and so that it wouldn't happen again. And those same practices aren't really being practiced in the US at the moment. And this connected to some of the criticisms that I brought up of the paper. And it's sort of a minority group, but it's a common criticism from that minority group that says, hey, what about the Caucasian enslaved people over time, the Nordic enslaved people, the indentured servants from Ireland, or the Africans that were enslaved by other Africans? And this framework about what aboutism, which is really just a deflection, because people seem to not want to accept certain historical events. And it's just sad that it's so relevant today in these times. hundreds of years after the transatlantic slave trade. We also talked a little bit about Native American admixture in people of African descent. So we talked about Native communities in the US, in South America, Central America, how they might have admixed with enslaved people that escaped from the coast, and also how these different countries might look at this admixture differently just based on cultural differences and societal differences. And that's about it.
Got it. Good. Well, thank you for all of that. We don't have a lot of time left, but I would like to give both Dr. Mountain and Micheletti, again, our thanks. But what are some of the considerations around this relatively new field of consumer genetics? This came up in our group, and I think a little bit more in each of the other groups to some extent. Because many of us have either participated, used something like 23andMe, or we know of people who have. How can we be aware of or find out what's going on in terms of those survey questions? Why is it, for example, if I take a test with this kit and I use a different company, I get a different result? How might we address that? Because that bubbled up in a couple of places last week at this week.
Yeah, so the question of different results from different companies has been around since the companies first launched, and it's interesting that I'm wondering if they're converging as they kind of fine tune the two basic fact components to those results are, first of all, the reference database. Who do you include as, say, representing the Philippines, or who do you include as representing South Korea, and who do you include as representing, let's say for this study, the Southern United States. So you need there's that reference data set that allows you to do not only the service about ancestry for customers, but also the research like in this paper. That representation is critical. But the other thing is the algorithm. And the algorithms have been evolving over the years, and have been fine-tuned. I was explaining in our breakout group that when we first assigned ancestry, we divide the world into three, very, very crudely. It was, Africa versus Europe versus Asia plus the Americas, and way too close to racial lines for my comfort. But the data kind of supported that because of human history. Human history has led to the variation we see today, and the three is kind of naturally falls out. So we made a big effort to improve the algorithm and the reference data so that we could provide ancestry results that were at a much more granular level, not just for the Europeans who were the bulk of the database, especially early on, but also for people from Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So we had numerous efforts to try to make sure that wherever your ancestry was from, you would get some level of detail. Mm-hmm. And that's really because of algorithm development and the build out of the database. So it's all the companies are doing this in parallel without really talking to each other, because we're companies.
Right.
We did
right.
at the beginning. Yeah. We had some conversations, but mm-hmm. not so much these days. And because we each think we're doing it the best. And why would you talk to people who aren't doing it the best?
Right. Well, I think it's helpful, particularly for us, and I see that we're dwindling down in terms of time, mm-hmm. Is that we've been able to have some conversations over the last couple of weeks around your research that have stimulated other conversations. And so on a exchange of ideas around research and around the implications of them, I think this is just going to roll forward. I think Vice President Sukuban has shared that there's an acknowledgement and reconciliation committee that is in the process of being formed. And I think this is the kind of, among other forms, other areas of research that will inform some of those conversations. And so I'm looking forward to that. I can see already that Group 2 gets the Blue Ribbon Prize for posting its notes in the chat. Very good, very good. Ours will come forward as well. And I think the other piece in terms of the conversation and moving forward is that we'll compile a set of notes. Can we do that, Dr. Sukuban? All these notes and share them with everyone,
yep.
Including our two guest lecturers, so that we have a very concrete takeaway, because this is a growing industry, and it touches on a lot of things that are happening both in terms of the community and not just the academic community. I also appreciate the fact that this has this multidisciplinary approach. I know with Dr. Micheletti, your background at the Hagerman Fishery culture, I mean, this idea of where you can take this kind of research across multiple species is really very important. And I think that's going to be very exciting for students who have these questions, but maybe approaching it from a lot of different vantage points. Dr. Sukuban, did you have any parting goodbyes?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Dr.
And thank you again, everyone, for being here. This has been great, and we will get those notes out to you. Dr. Sukuban.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad, and thank you again to Dr. Micheletti and Dr. Mountain for joining us for the two-part series. This is the first one out of the monthly series that we've done since the summertime, so thank you all for participating. I learned a lot, and I hope all of you did as well. So before we part, I want to put a shameless plug in for our next program for November. It's November 2nd from noon to 1 for an event that's called No Equal Justice, a conversation with Benjamin Crump. As many of you know, Mr. Crump is an attorney who specializes in civil rights, and he is currently head of the legal team for George Floyd's family and served as co-counsel for the family of Breonna Taylor. We are so excited for this conversation, and sign up for the event is going to be in the chat here in just a minute. And we hope that you all will also follow the social media. We'll also post it on there as well. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and let me get that post in the chat before you all leave. So if you'd like to sign up for it, please feel free to jump on the Qualtrics and share with others as well. So thank you all for spending your afternoon with us, and have a good evening.